Welcome everyone. I hope everybody can hear me clearly. Welcome to this first webinar in our series, Minimizing Environmental Impact of Research and Logistics in the Polar Regions. This is a collaboration between the European Polar Board, the EPB, and APECS, which is the Association of Polar Early Career Scientists. My name is Marije Tempel from the EPB, and I'm a project officer at the Secretariat. Before introducing our speaker of today, I'd like to highlight the synthesis report on environmental impact of research and logistics in the polar regions. This report, drafted by the EPB's Action Group on Environmental Impact, covers potential environmental impacts, best practices for minimization, legal frameworks, and a catalog of existing guidelines. And you can actually access this report online. You can find a link in the chat box that my colleague Eva will share with you there. Yeah, and the reason that I mention this is that this webinar series was initiated by the Action Group as a follow-up to this report to, well, get everybody together to have a nice discussion and have some more lectures about this subject. This series consists of 4 sessions, and each webinar will feature a 40-minute roughly lecture followed by a Q&A session. And that's why we also really encourage your participation as attendees by sharing your questions in our Q&A box. You can find this below in the webinar screen. And if you have any questions during the presentation, you can also share your questions here. My colleague Nina, who is also attending, she's my colleague from the EPB, she will moderate the Q&A session after the lecture. Please note that we are recording all webinars, so also this one, and we will be sharing them on our YouTube channel, which you can also find in the chat box. Eva will share it there. Okay, so now I'm pleased to introduce our speaker of today, Dr. Kevin Hughes from the British Antarctic Survey. He is the Environmental Research and Monitoring Manager at the British Antarctic Survey, BAS, and a member of the UK delegation to the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting. And yes, his extensive experience includes roles as former vice chair of the Committee for Environmental Protection and convener of the subsidiary group on climate change response. And currently, Dr. Hughes co-chairs the Scientific Committee on the Antarctic Research Program, and this one is called Integrated Science to Inform Antarctic and Southern Ocean Conservation. And within the context of the Antarctic, he has broad science and policy interests, including conservation, geological heritage, area protection, non-native species, as we are talking about today, environmental impact assessments, and environmental monitoring. So enough to talk about. He has visited the polar regions 11 times, including one Antarctic winter, so enough experience on the ground as well. And he is here today to talk about the introduction of non-native species in the polar regions. We will talk mostly about the Antarctic region here. So a warm welcome to Kevin Hughes, and I hope you will enjoy this lecture with us. We will now switch to the presentation of Kevin.
Right. Can you all see that? I see some nods. That's great. There we go. Okay, well, firstly, thank you very much for that very warm and kind introduction. I've worked, as you said, on the issue of non-native species for many years across a science, policy, and implementation perspective. I'm going to talk predominantly about non-native species in the Antarctic Treaty Area, and I'll touch very briefly upon them in the sub-Antarctic islands, but really just focusing on the treaty area. So first slide. So the talk structure. Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of what the problem is with non-native species, the current status of non-native species in Antarctica, a little bit about legislation and agreements, quite a lot about biosecurity because it's really important. And I couldn't resist a few recommendations at the end. And then we have the polar alien hunters video if there's time, which was done by some really talented early career researchers. And then we have some questions at the end. So I think it's useful to have some definitions at the start so we know what we're talking about. So what is a non-native or an alien species? Well, this is an organism that's occurring outside its natural range and dispersal potential, whose presence in Antarctica is pretty much due to human action. So it's been taken from outside Antarctica to that region due to human activities. An invasive species is a subset of non-native species, which once they get to Antarctica are expanding their distribution and actually causing harm to the environment or to ecosystem function. So they're basically bad news. I think it's important to maybe think about, why non-natives are such a problem. And if you think about other environmental problems like an oil spill, the impact initially is huge with, oil everywhere impacting birds and other wildlife. But over time, the oil will evaporate. You'll have bioremediation, and maybe over a decade or two, things might go back to normal. It's very different with an invasive species. Once it's introduced, you might not even know for years and years. Only once it starts to expand and move, increase its distribution, might you notice it. And often at that point, it's too late. Because once it gets going and starts spreading, that's it pretty much forever. You're very unlikely to be able to eradicate it. So that's really not good. So what is the problem, particularly in Antarctica? Well, as you know, Antarctica has been isolated from the rest of the world for about the last 30 million years or so. Once the Antarctic Peninsula split off from South America, we had the formation of the circumpolar current. And that caused Antarctica to cool, but it also caused effectively a barrier to the introduction of species by natural means from outside the continent. And in that time, we've had some amazing, unique biological organisms have evolved and biological communities have formed, both in marine and terrestrial environments. About 200 to 300 years ago, humans turned up and they brought with them non-native species, and they have had impacts on the region. And this is bad for Antarctic ecosystems, and we as stewards for this continent, it's our responsibility to stop that. But it's also bad for our science because we study these simple ecosystems. And by introducing new species, we make it more complicated. And that makes it very difficult to do the science. So we have various barriers to invasion, and we're seeing those barriers being eroded. So on the left, you have the source population. On the right, you have this new Antarctic population. And the dispersal barrier is being eroded by there being increased human activity. It makes it easier for species to get into Antarctica whenever people are going there. We also have the survival barrier, and this is being eroded by climate change. It makes it much easier for species, once they get there, to be able to colonize and persist in the region. And in terms of terrestrial introductions, we are seeing large levels of national operator activity with the importation of people, cargo, fresh foods, construction materials, etc. And you can have various propagules and species associated with these things like plants or seeds or insects or insect eggs or microorganisms associated with non-sterile soil. We are also seeing an expanding tourism industry. I think there were 122,000 tourists visited Antarctica last season. When I started out, there was only about 7 or 8,000 went down. So it's rapidly expanded. I mentioned climate change. The Antarctic Peninsula in particular has warmed with huge impacts in terms of ice shelf collapse and glacier retreat. And now we're seeing that climate change impacting the rest of the continent too. So when you take all of these factors into consideration, you can actually do a risk assessment and work out which areas of Antarctica are most likely to become invaded. Now, if you look at this map, you can see that the Antarctic Peninsula clearly is the area that is most vulnerable because you get lots of people visiting there and it's the warmest area. It's the least climatically harsh. Not to say that places like the Ross Sea region or other oases around East Antarctica aren't vulnerable too, but by far the peninsula is vulnerable, with the South Shetland Islands as well. And actually Deception Island is the most at-risk location. I think I need to tell you about a more subtle problem. And this is the intra-regional transfer of native Antarctic species. So Antarctica is basically hundreds of thousands of islands of ice-free ground separated by snow, ice, and ocean. And each of those little islands of rock are separate, and they might have evolved their own species, or they might have evolved their own collections of species that provide the community. Some work was done recently to try and divide Antarctica up into ecoregions, and we have 16 of them, and they are biologically distinct. And what we don't want to do is to mix up the species from one ecoregion into the other. So unhelpfully for the British Antarctic Survey, all of our research stations seem to be in different ecoregions. So we have to be very careful not to transfer species from one of our stations to another. I want to talk a little bit about marine introductions. So non-native species, marine non-native species can be transferred by ships, both in ballast water, but also on hulls through biofouling. Another route is through pollution, plastic pollution and marine debris, which once released in the rest of the world can potentially carry species to Antarctica, although those species have to basically stick to that debris for months, if not years, and they have to have very special life cycle characteristics to be able to survive that journey. So over 100 ships travel to Antarctica each year, predominantly to the Antarctic Peninsula region. That includes tourist, governmental, military, and fishing vessels, and the numbers are going up. And they mainly visit South Shetland Islands and also the Northern Peninsula. And this is some work done by a very talented researcher, Arlie McCarthy, a few years ago, and she looked at where ships were going. And it turns out that out of the top 20 most visited locations, 19 of them were in the South Shetlands or the Northern Peninsula. So this really is these are the places we should be looking out for introductions. Arlie also looked to see where all these ships were coming from. And if you look at the figure, you can see that on the outside, all the different ports all around the world where the ships were, it was their last departure port before they came to Antarctica. And ports, just by their nature, tend to be hotspots for invasive species. And it's really hard to know the diversity of species that could be being brought down to Antarctica aboard ships from all over the world. A few years ago, we did an exercise to try and see which species we thought were most likely to become introduced to Antarctica in the next sort of 10 years or so, via various different routes of ships, cargo, aircraft, etc. So we came up with a list and a kind of a top sort of 10 or 13 species, which included terrestrial plants, terrestrial invertebrates. We didn't think rodents were going to be able to survive, so that was good. But we also had some marine species. And right at the top of the list was the Chilean mussel. And much to our slight horror, a couple of months after we published our paper, we saw this paper by some Chilean scientists, which actually recorded the Chilean mussel had established on King George Island, just off the coast there. So our predictions were coming true. In that case, the mussel didn't survive for very long. The conditions were too harsh, but it just shows the potential for these invasions to happen and for these species to colonize and potentially become invasive. So what's the current status of non-native species in Antarctica? Well, in the broader subantarctic region, we have over 200 non-native plants and vertebrates, including rats and rabbits, and other microorganisms. They've all been found in the subantarctic. The Antarctic treaty area, in contrast, is actually relatively unimpacted. We've only got about 20 known terrestrial non-native species. That includes small species like springtails, insects, and a grass. And some of these are actually only found within research stations. The species can't survive outside because it's too extreme, but they do survive in the station. And that's called synanthropic. And if you look at the graph, you can see that many of these species have been around for decades, which tells us either there hasn't been much effort to eradicate them or that they're too difficult to eradicate. If you remember the earlier map, which predicted where we were going to find non-natives, it was basically the peninsula, and that's the reality of what we find when we look. The Northern Peninsula, the South Shetland Islands, and the South Orkney Islands have all contain the great majority of the non-native species. We don't find any on the continent that have managed to persist. And really, it's this peninsula region which is most at risk, and particularly Deception Island. It's the most invaded location, and that's because the soils are geothermally heated, as are some of the waters, which makes it much easier for species, once they're introduced, to establish and persist in those locations. It's quite a different story when we come to non-native species. We know of no established marine non-native species. However, that's not saying very much, because we haven't really looked. It's extremely difficult to do monitoring for non-native species because these marine communities are so rich and diverse. You need huge taxonomic expertise to tell the species apart. And also, it's really difficult to get in the water and to do these monitoring activities. However, we do know that species are transported to the region. We have a list of species we think are likely to be introduced and the sites that they're likely to be found. And I think it's important to realize that these species could have devastating effects on the biodiversity. And actually, even globally, eradication is almost impossible for marine species. I think there's only been 2 successful attempts anywhere in the world. So it would be almost impossible in Antarctica. I want to give you a few quick examples of non-native species that have been introduced and the impacts that they've had. So this is the flightless midge Eretmoptera murphyi. It was introduced to Cygni Island on the South Orkney Islands from South Georgia back in the 1960s. Recent research has shown that the midge is starting to spread across the island. And it lives most of its life cycle as these larvae, shown in the bottom picture there. And you can find these in huge numbers, up to 150,000 larvae per meter squared, which is much more than the sum of all of the other native soil fauna put together. So it really is a large change for that ecosystem. And what they do, those larvae chomp away at the peat, and in doing so, they release large amounts of nutrients into the systems, which is much more than would happen normally. So these are actually ecosystem engineers, these species. And we really don't know what longer term impact this midge larvae could have across the terrestrial environment. Worryingly, we've done some physiology experiments, and we can show that this larvae or this midge could survive much, much further south, all the way down to 67 degrees south, sort of the midway down the Antarctic Peninsula. So if it was to spread, it could have serious consequences. So we need to put in place very strict biosecurity on Cygni Island to stop new species coming in, but also to stop that particular species getting off the island to other locations. The annual bluegrass, or Poa annua, is one of the most invasive plants on the planet. It's found everywhere, and that includes Antarctica. And it's been shown that this plant can actually outcompete native plants, which is very worrying. Now, it's been introduced on many occasions over the past century or so, and often it's been pulled out because it's only been one or two plants, and it's been quite easy to eradicate. However, Poa annua was introduced to near the Arctowski station back in the 1980s, and now it's spread away from the station into a local protected area. And Poland has put in considerable efforts to try to eradicate this grass. But this has turned out to be really difficult because it produces seeds, and those seeds form a seed bank, and they just keep germinating and coming up year after year. So it's a real challenge, and I'm very grateful to our Polish colleagues for all the work that they're doing to try and control that grass. My final example is the winter crane fly, Trichossera maculopennis. So this was found breeding in the sewage treatment plants of research stations on King George Island. And it's from Northern Europe, so it can survive low temperatures. And it's been spreading from one research station to another, and it's kind of hopped across much of King George Island over the last sort of 10 or 15 years. This year, though, for the first time, it was reported that the fly was reproducing in the natural environment, which is very worrying because really once that happens, the chances of controlling it are very small. So we might now have, well, there are two native insects in Antarctica, and this is another one, plus the midge, that's another one. So we're building the numbers up now. So we're not quite sure what's going to happen here going forward. I think I need to touch a little bit about legislation and international agreements about non-native species. So the really most important piece of international legislation is Annex 2 to the Protocol on Environmental Protection to the Antarctic Treaty. And this prohibits the introduction of non-native species or non-sterile soil unless you've got a permit. And it also also says that if you do introduce a species, it's your responsibility to have it eradicated. The other agreement is the International Maritime Organization Ballast Water Management Convention, which states that you need to be treating your ballast water to make sure it's not moving species around the world whenever it's being released, which is great. Unfortunately, though, when it comes to ship biofiling, we don't have mandatory legislation. We've only got some guidelines. So I think there are opportunities there. So the Annex 2 to the protocol is generally put into effect through domestic legislation. And in the UK's case, that is through the Antarctic Act. And if we do something wrong within the British Antarctic Survey, we could be subject to up to 2 years in prison or an unlimited fine. So that really does focus our minds in terms of, not taking our responsibilities seriously. I think also in the sub-Antarctic islands, they're under sovereign areas. They're under the legislation of that nation. So they have their own rules as well. So practical management, what can you really do about all of this? So by far, the most important thing you can do is put in place really strong and solid biosecurity. So this takes time, it takes investment, and you have to keep doing it. It never ends. Also, no one is ever going to thank you for not introducing a non-native species. So biosecurity, if it's done well, will not get you any thanks, but it is still extremely important because there's so much at stake if we don't do it. There's plenty of advice out there for what you can do for biosecurity. The Council of Managers of National Antarctic Programs has its checklists for supply chain managers of National Antarctic Programs. The Committee for Environmental Protection's got its non-native species manual. The International Association of Antarctica Tour Operators has guidance for both deep field and ship-based tourism activities. And the Scientific Committee for Antarctic Research has got field codes of conduct across for scientific activities whenever you're outside the stations. So within BAS, we have our biosecurity regulations, and this is I'm responsible for this. It's quite a large document, about 100 and something pages long. It covers the whole of our operation, and you know, from training through to all the different elements of our operation and across our footprint. So it's really comprehensive. And probably the most important thing that we do is to provide biosecurity specific training. So everyone who goes to Antarctica has a specific piece of training on biosecurity so they know what to do. But we also provide bespoke specific training for, say, supply chain logistics workers in warehousing, or the catering managers or the station leaders, so they know exactly what they should be doing specifically for their role. We give people the kit they need to comply. We've got biosecurity stations with vacuum cleaners and tweezers and brushes so they can clean their equipment before they go south, and their clothing. We provide information, and this is a little mini guide to Antarctic invasive species, just to flag in our personnel what they should be looking out for in terms of things that shouldn't be there and that they need to report as quickly as possible. Logistical supply chains tend to be very long and complicated, but it's extremely important that we have high biosecurity standards all along those supply chains, from the suppliers back in our home countries to the headquarters where we do the packing, to the departure ports, to our southern logistic hubs that might be in South America or elsewhere, right the way through to our ships, our research stations, and people once they're in the field. It's all extremely important. So we are very fortunate that at BAS, we've just acquired a new biosecurity facility, and that's going to allow enhanced biosecurity across our containerization for our new ship. And we're looking into equivalent provision for our gateway ports in South America and the Falkland Islands. We ensure that all of our cargo and ISO containers are thoroughly cleaned, and that we've put in provisions to prevent rodents and insects getting to Antarctica, and that includes fogging the inside of the container with insecticide. And we're also very careful with break bulk cargo and stuff which won't fit in a container. So if there's some construction materials there and we've pressure washed the inside of the tubing, we've sealed the end so no rodents or insects can get in. So these are the sorts of steps that we take. When it comes to loading our ships, we have rodent detection dogs on site, and they do a sweep of the ship, and they also check each container to make sure there's no rats in there. And we've also got cleaning services. So if any of the containers or vehicles have got soil on them, we can pressure wash that off before it gets loaded onto the ship. Once we get to our research stations, we've got this clean in, clean out policy. So everything that comes onto the station should be spotless, and everything that leaves should also be clean. So when the ship comes alongside at the wharf, we unload the containers. They'll transport it up to the Discovery building, the blue building here. And there's 2 biosecurity facilities. So everything that comes off the ship goes through the biosecurity facility and is thoroughly checked before it goes to their warehouses or other parts of the research station. And we've also put in place facilities on our 2 stations in the South Georgia as well. When it comes to our ships, we have very stringent measures to stop the introduction of rodents, rodent rat guards on the lines, ultrasonic rat deterrents on the gangways, and also means to clean your boots and clothing with, those are some boot washers there. So this just gives people the capacity to take their biosecurity responsibilities seriously. When it comes to our aircraft operation, we currently don't have anywhere to check the people or the cargo, including fresh fruit and vegetables, that comes off the aircraft. And aircraft are very high risk because they can transport non-native species very rapidly, like in 3 or 4 hours, from outside Antarctica right through to our research station, which greatly enhances their chances of survival should they be released. So we're very fortunate that we're getting a new hangar in the next few years, and we've actually got a biosecurity facility in that so that we can put in place our really good measures. Fresh foods are another item which are high risk. You can get insects, microorganisms, slugs, spiders, flies inside the leaves, soil sometimes. So what has actually occurred is that we've prohibited the introduction of some plant produce into some of our locations, notably South Georgia. And we do not allow hydroponic cultivation on our stations, unlike some other and not some other research stations, because we just think the risk is too high. There have been too many cases of infestations. So we're not prepared to take that risk. So we have mandatory checks on all fresh foods. So every individual item is checked for pests, but also for disease or rot. We only source pre-washed root vegetables, so there's no soil on them. And we deploy insect UV zappers and sticky insects around our stations. However, things do go wrong sometimes. It's inevitable with operations of the scale that we're talking about. And we have our biosecurity incident response, and it has this DIE is the way we remember it, which stands for detect, isolate, and then eradicate. Once you've done that, then you need to report so that we can understand what went wrong so that we can put it right. We strongly believe in the concept of continuous improvement. And we have an environmental management system at BAS, ISO 14001. And through that, we undertake biosecurity audits across the organization and our suppliers. We've got a very useful and well-used incident reporting system, so we know what's going wrong so we can put it right. And our senior management has adopted this biosecurity action plan, which lays out all the things that we need to be doing to get up to the standard that we think is appropriate, and it allows us to track progress over time. We also do spot checks. So if somebody turns up on station or on the ship, we can say, oh, can we have a quick look at what your boots, at your clothing, just to see if it's clean. And if it's not, we give them the opportunity to put things right. And all of this is overseen by our competent national authority, which is the UK government. So challenges and opportunities. I think perhaps the big challenge for many national Antarctic programs is where to target their effort. So I think I've made it pretty clear that I think, and many others around the world think, that prevention is by far the best thing to do, and biosecurity gives you absolutely the best, the most cost-effective use of your resources. It is, however, important that we do monitoring. If you look at this figure here, it shows the year each non-native species occurrence was first recorded in Antarctica. That goes from about the 1940s right up to more or less today. And you'll see that every so often you get reports of one or two species throughout that time period, except for around about 2010. And this was the period that was just following the International Polar Year, 2007, 2008, where there was a big emphasis on non-native species and the Aliens in Antarctica project. And that led to a lot of effort for surveying. And I think that a lot of that was done through some German researchers who did some excellent work on the Antarctic Peninsula. And I think the take-home message here is that if you look, you do tend to find things, but we just aren't very good at looking. We just don't put the resource into looking. So that's perhaps an opportunity for us to reflect on how we divvy up our resources. I think what's happening now is a lot of the resources going to response, to trying to eradicate or control non-native species. And that would include the Poa annua that I talked about earlier, and also the Trichoceras, the fly that's on King George Island and is spreading. Trying to record that is to eradicate that is going to be extremely difficult, if not impossible, but it has taken a lot of time and attention over the last few years. So a few recommendations I couldn't resist. Firstly, I'd say that we need to be ensuring that biosecurity has and maintains a high profile and has effective delivery across all organizations. So that's national Antarctic programs, the tourism industry, but also other areas that we don't maybe think about as much, such as a lot of the military who are going to Antarctica and the fishing industry. We need to be promoting open communication and engagement between national Antarctic programs about biosecurity challenges. Frankly, I don't really know what other national Antarctic programs are doing. And I would love to know, because I have problems and I'm sure they have problems too. And it might be nice to share information so we can do things better. I think we need work to reduce the risk of marine species introductions, particularly via biofiling on ships. We need to be undertaking monitoring for non-native species in both terrestrial and marine environments, because I'm not sure we've got a very good idea of the scale of the problem. And finally, it would be really good if we could develop methods and tools for the control and eradication of non-native plants and invertebrates in Antarctica. And that's what's particularly important there is that we aren't allowed to use pesticides under the Antarctic Treaty. So we need to be looking at other methods, and that's an important next step. So just to conclude, Antarctic marine and terrestrial ecosystems are unique, but are increasingly vulnerable to non-native species introductions. Increasing human activity and climate change make non-native species introductions and establishment more likely, but thoughtful long-term biosecurity precautions are by far the most cost-effective way to minimize the risk and actually protect Antarctica, because that is our job. We are stewards for this continent, and that's what we should be doing. So I think that's my talk over, and I think I'd like now to stop sharing, and we can play the video. Let me just stop sharing. Is that okay?
Yes, so I'm gonna share the video now. Let me know if there is no sound.
Do we have any porridge, Jess?
Ollie! There was an alien on your boot.
Oh, is it really that serious?
Yes. And I can show you with your porridge.
Hey!
Let's imagine where we are.
That's Antarctica. That's where we are.
There is a barrier around Antarctica called the polar vortex, and it keeps the continent isolated and cold. Antarctica is home to many unique things that live nowhere else in the world.
So the barrier is like a magical shield? Like something made by a wizard or magician?
No.
Aw.
It's not magic, it's science. Where cold air and waters from the south meet warm tropical waters and air from the north, they push against each other and create the powerful ocean currents and winds that keep Antarctica cold and isolated. But climate change is raising global temperatures, and as the Antarctic warms, living things from other places can survive here now. Climate change helps to open the door to aliens. An alien species can be a grass seed, an insect, or a crab. Any living thing from outside the region.
Oh, Antarctica is home to so many wonderful living things.
Yes.
Aliens are bad news. I know that in other places, alien species take the food and homes of local species. But how did aliens get here?
Aliens can travel to Antarctica in many ways. On boats, on boots, even in camera bags.
But if humans are responsible, does that make us the villains? Hey!
We don't have to be. Actually, there is a lot we can do to stop the alien invasion. Before you arrive, here is an idea. Check, clean, and wash your gear. And remember, disinfect if you suspect that an alien is going unchecked. Do that regularly on the trip too, anytime you go somewhere new. Also watch where you walk. Aliens love mud and organic goo. Finally, if you think you have found an alien, say something! Share photos of your biosecurity actions when you share your holiday snaps too. We do! Together we can do this!
Thank you very much. So that was a video that was produced by some early career researchers, some of whom were doing their PhDs on non-native species, and they just decided we're going to do this and create this polar alien hunters group. And I think it's wonderful, and we use that video in our training to our personnel. I think it's mostly aimed at the tourism industry, but I still think the message is very relevant. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kevin, for this great overview and also presenting the practical steps and recommendations for the on the topic, and also for all the great work that BAS is doing on this matter, because it's hugely important. So we do have a Q&A session now, so please don't hesitate to leave your questions in the Q&A box. And we already have a couple of questions here, so I will start with the first one. So Colleen is asking, hi, thank you for the talk. Do you have similar procedures depending on the station? For example, Antarctic Peninsula Station versus Halley 6? Or do you adapt for each station? And if yes, what are the differences?
That is a very good question. So clearly the risk to the native species is very different depending on where you go. And basically, the more extreme the environment, the less likely that a species is going to be able to establish. So at Halley 6 station, it's on an ice shelf. There's no ice-free ground. There are no terrestrial communities around there. So really, the chances of anything establishing and living there are almost zero. However, we try to put in place the same biosecurity across all of our operation, because it just gets too complicated if we start having separate rules for separate locations. The only exceptions, I think, are that on South Georgia, we do have a prohibition put in place actually by the South Georgia government for leafy vegetables that I mentioned before, because they are such high-risk items, and those warmer subantarctic islands are so much more at risk of introductions. And the other thing that we would potentially allow, although we haven't yet, is we might allow hydroponics at Halley, but nowhere else. But again, we haven't really gone down that route, but it's something we might think about because the risk is low at that location. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you very much. So the next question comes from Osgun. Firstly, I would like to thank Kevin for the presentation. It is always a pleasure to listen to him. And the question is, does Kevin think current mitigation measures in practice or legislation are protective enough to keep the non-native species away from Antarctica?
Okay, so whatever we do, it will never be enough. We're never going to be 100% effective at stopping species getting in, no matter what we do. But we need to be doing our absolute best. And I think there is a balance. Antarctic programs only have so much resource available. There are many other calls on their resources, and they have to make some hard decisions as to where they're going to put their effort. I think I've quite clearly suggested that biosecurity is the best place. But at the same time, it is very difficult to do that in a way that is going to be absolutely 100% effective. And I think that many national Antarctic programs might struggle to deliver completely effective biosecurity. But I think it's very hard to know what others are doing. As I've said, I don't understand. I haven't really got insights as to what steps other nations are taking. And I think it would be very helpful because, as I said, it might be an idea to be able to share knowledge and expertise and try and see if we can help each other, because it's always good to talk and understand.
Thank you very much. So the next question is from Dogaj. I'm sorry for pronunciation of the names. So which type of marine vessels, tourist, fishing, or scientific, do you think has the most potential to cause introduction of non-native species?
So I don't think I don't think species really care too much. I think they will stick to a hull if they get the chance. And if that species is being moved across into Antarctica, well, it's there. I think though the duration of time spent in the ports makes a big difference. So if say a National Antarctic Program or military vessel is alongside in the home port for a long time, that gives more opportunity for species to stick to the hull. Also, once they get down to their destination in Antarctica, if they're there for a few days or weeks, that also gives opportunities for those species to fall off the hull into the environment. Tourist vessels tend to be quite quick and rapid in their movement across from one location to the next, so perhaps the risk isn't as high, but I'm not entirely sure that anyone's really done those calculations to make it to give us very definitive answers. Fishing vessels, I think it's been suggested that they very rarely come to the nearshore environment, so perhaps the risk is lower. But personally, I've seen fishing vessels. People come to the Antarctic, they need a little bit of recreation, they come off the ship, so they do come to the nearshore environment. So I don't know. I think more work needs to be done in this area.
Thank you. So the next question is, can we expect newcomers moving by natural ways with the climate change?
Yeah, that's a very good point. So I think that there's been some speculation that the rate of natural colonization of Antarctica is actually extremely low, and that human activities increases the rate of species transfer by a factor of about 100 or more. So humans by far are the major source of species introduction compared to natural routes. Saying that, I think species can come in by natural routes, but the difficulty we have is then knowing whether that new species in Antarctica that someone might find, to actually know if that was introduced by humans or by nature. So a few years ago, I was on Deception Island with a colleague, investigating the report of a plant called Nasovia magellanica, which is a plant found on the southern tip of South America. It's not found in Antarctica, but it's perfectly reasonable that plant seeds might have been blown across and become established on Deception Island, or it could have been taken across by humans. We just had no way of telling. So my colleague and I removed the plant as an act of precaution, but we might be wrong. And the thing is, native plants or species that are introduced by natural means are protected under the protocol. Non-native species need to be eradicated. And if you don't know which it is, how do you know what action to take? It's really difficult. So we decided to be precautionary, but we might have got it wrong.
Great, thank you. And we have the last question in the Q&A box. We do have several more minutes to go, so please don't hesitate if you have more questions. So thank you for the insightful webinar. However, I have a doubt. Can't the rodent detection dogs used in the ships also introduce the non-native species in Antarctica?
Okay, so the rodent detection dogs are only used in the UK and in the Falkland Islands. So those dogs do not travel to Antarctica, and we're actually not allowed to introduce dogs because they are a non-native species. We're not allowed to introduce them to Antarctica. And in some respects, we used to have husky dogs in Antarctica for pulling sledges, and they were taken out in the 1990s because the environmental protocol was coming into force, which specifically says that we shouldn't have non-native species. So I think in this case, we don't have a risk from those dogs.
All right, thank you. Yes, Attila, please.
Thanks, Kevin, for the great talk. Actually, my question is somehow related with Antonio's question. Beside of the human presence in Antarctica, what are the natural factors that make a region more vulnerable to the introduction of these species?
Okay. So there's the many factors. The proximity to sites of other biology. So, for example, basically the Antarctic Peninsula is really close to South America. It's by far the closest part to South America. So that proximity makes it easier for species to be introduced. So if you've got a flight, say, from South America to the peninsula, it's only 3 or 4 hours, and or a ship is only two days. That means that those species are more likely to survive that journey compared to, say, the Ross Sea or East Antarctica, where it might be a week or more. Also, the climatic factors. What's the climate like at that location? Is it really, really cold in the summertime? Is it really cold throughout the year? Is that species going to be able to survive there? Is there enough ice-free ground there for it to actually colonize? Is there soil? Is there organic material there that might make it easier for the, say, a plant to colonize, for example? But also which areas have the greatest level of human activity, which is most likely to bring species in. So I think if you think about, as I said, we've seen all of the established terrestrial species on the peninsula. We have seen practically nothing on the continent. So I think that tells us very strongly that it's these physical factors that make a strong influence on whether these species can survive. Is it, the extremeness of the temperature can make a huge difference as to whether species are going to establish or not. Does that kind of cover? It's a very broad response potentially, but I'm just wondering, does that kind of give you more or less what you hoped to hear?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. And we have another question in the Q&A box from Antonio. What makes a non-native species becoming more competitive than the native species?
Yeah, that's a very good question. There are some species that are just globally good at adapting to new environments. They've got this, their genome allows them to adapt to a wide range of environmental conditions, for example. Poa annua, as I said, it's found pretty much in every country in the world. It's so invasive and it's spread so easily, and it's now got to Antarctica. And that allows it, this plasticity, this flexibility allows it to adapt to new environments and new habitats and quickly colonize. I think in other cases, such as some of the insects, a lot of the national Antarctic programs are from Northern European locations or North America or Northern Asia. So the potential is to pick up species that are already adapted to low temperatures and transport them all the way down to Antarctica to a similar environment where it's not very difficult for them to establish and reproduce. And the Trichoceras fly would be an example of that, or the Eretmoptera midge from South Georgia. So they're already pre-adapted to low temperatures and physically difficult environments. So that really does help them in terms of their success at establishing and becoming invasive.
Thank you. So I suggest we take the last question. there is another one in the Q&A box. So humans clearly are the biggest factor in introduction of non-native species in Antarctica, but human presence range from scientists working year-round to short-term, and also tourists visiting for even shorter term. Has there been any clear indication so far where tourists has been a lead factor due to lack of awareness and scientific knowledge as compared to the scientists?
That is an excellent question. So, all of what was said was very, very correct. Tourists tend to come down to Antarctica. It's a very special event for them. They often tend to buy brand new clothing, get new coats. Everything is clean. IATO, the International Association of Antarctica Tour Operators, are very good at putting in place biosecurity for their visitors. They have very strict biosecurity precautions on their ship, etc. So in some respects, because the tourism industry, their model is very simple, they haven't got lots of complex cargo operations or anything else, it's easier for them to put in place really good biosecurity. So in some respects, although the numbers are very high in terms of tourists coming in, the risk for each of those tourists is probably not that high. So overall, it's not so bad. It's very different, I think, for national Antarctic programs. We have hugely complex operations, ships, aircraft, large amounts of cargo, construction materials. All of these things need to be taken down. They need to be biosecured before they're taken out. That's really, really difficult and costs a lot of money, actually. I think for some of our building work, it's about 1% of our budget went on biosecurity. It's a lot. So it makes national Antarctic programs more likely to introduce things. And I think the evidence so far is that the tourism industry, there's no evidence that tourism has brought in a non-native species. No concrete evidence, whereas there's plenty of evidence that national Antarctic programs have brought in non-native species. And just one last thing, we did a study looking at the number of seeds and other propagules on clothing of tourists, national Antarctic program staff, scientists, etc. Tourists were much cleaner in terms of their propagule load than researchers. Because, as I said, tourists are buying new stuff. The researchers are just throwing on the coat they had last year and, off they go. I think that's changing, but that's what we found about 15 years ago. So.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, you're very popular, Kevin. We have more questions. So let's just take them very briefly, I guess, because we're approaching the end of our time here. But I'll go with both of them and then just give you to answer. So thank you for the nice talk. What will be the threshold that we will need to establish to separate alien species introduced by human activities to those that will naturally disperse southwards with climate change? Or shall we consider all as the same and at the same danger level? And right away, the second question and the last one. Great talk. What kinds of new technologies can Antarctic programs be using? For example, DNA environmental, drones for detecting alien species, and so on.
Yeah, maybe I'll take the second question first. So I think, so I've done a bit of work with some colleagues from lots of different countries, actually looking at eDNA as a tool for detecting of non-native species. I think there's potential there, but I don't think we're there yet. And I think you just need some good old-fashioned taxonomic experts to look at samples to see what the invertebrates are, to see what the plants are, to detect things in those ways. It's very reliable if you get the people who know what they're talking about. So I would absolutely advocate that. I think there's potential for remote sensing for drones, to look for potentially just the dispersal of known non-native species that might be in the pipeline. But again, I'm a great believer in old-fashioned methods of just getting down and taking a look, and if it shouldn't be there, pull it up. eradicate it. We don't need to overthink this. I think some of the simple methods are cheap and very effective, but we just need to put the efforts into using them. I'm sorry, I've completely forgotten what the first question was.
Yes, sure. So is there any threshold that we can think of to establish to separate alien species introduced by human activities to those that are naturally coming because of the climate change? Shall we consider them as the same danger?
Okay. Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay, so natural colonists. Okay, so if there was no climate change, we would be very keen to eradicate species that have been introduced by humans, but we would be very keen to leave and allow the expansion and reproduction of species that were brought in by natural means. That's quite clear. I think it's less clear what we do if species are introduced at an increasing rate because of climate change. And I don't think anyone's really got any solid or sensible answers to that yet. I think trying to actually distinguish that between otherwise you'd never have any species ever introduced to Antarctica if you just eradicated everything that was new. So I think we need to have that discussion and try and understand ourselves where we lie, where we sit on that. But it's a very good question, and I'm not sure there's a very clear answer for that one. So I'm not sure I can help any further.
All right. Thank you very much for all the questions. They were very, very on point and super interesting. Thank you.
And thank you very much to APECS and EPB for inviting me. It's been a real pleasure, and I wish you the very best with the rest of your webinar series.
Thank you so much, Kevin. I would just want to say some last words. Maybe we can pull up the last slide.
Yes.
So yeah, I want to thank you, Kevin, and I want to thank all of you who've been attending this webinar. It was the first webinar that we had of this session, of this series. So please keep an eye out for upcoming webinars where we will explore more aspects around this topic. And where the first two webinars, you already see the second one here, you can already register if you scan the QR code. So these two webinars, the first two are more on the impacts that are actually happening. And then at the third webinar, we will look a bit more at the top-down mitigation approaches, particularly the Madrid protocols, and the role of it by protecting the Antarctica. And the last webinar will be organized by APECS, and we will more explore the bottom-up initiatives instead of the top-down initiatives of researchers and younger researchers as well, to minimize their own footprint, and what kind of practical guidelines are there to, well, just adapt as a researcher going there, what we already heard about today as well. So yes, take a good look at these, and thank you once again, Kevin, for your contribution. And once again, all of you, thank you for your participation and all your questions. It's been a really engaging discussion as well. And I wish you a nice afternoon, and till next time.
Thank you. Bye.
Goodbye.